Hi, I'm Nina, and I'm a baroque violinist specialising in improvisation. And I'm going to present some of the results of my PhD research, titled Fantasising About the Past, a Baroque Violinist's Guide to Improvising Fantasias. As this conference attests to, the performance of and research into historical improvisation is happily ever increasing. However, specifically within the domain of the Baroque fantasia, this remains largely in both performance and research the domain of keyboardists. We need more specific research into other instruments in order to broaden this practice. As a Baroque violinist myself, therefore, my research focuses on how to improvise a fantasia on the violin. I will begin here with some general guidance that I found from treatises before delving more into the specifics of the violin itself. So talking through a little bit of the analysis I've done of composed fantasias by two of the most prolific composers of this genre for the violin, Telemann and Matthäus. But of course, despite all this explicit knowledge, we still need a way to embed this in our practice. And so then I will discuss one of the major issues that I found when trying to do this as a violinist, which is harmonise myself, and discuss a method I've come up with to help violinists with this that I call harmony handshakes, as well as discuss the usefulness that I found in games in applying all of this knowledge. So alongside this, I will also include some short live improvisations from the very different styles, showing you the different kinds of fantasia and also the practical nature of this approach. I have found that improvising in the different styles requires very different sets of knowledge, and that all of these different styles require separate consideration, so that's why I've split it, the presentation basically in two, the first half looking at Matthäus and the second half looking at Telemann. Including more improvised fantasias on the violin and other instruments into live performance would create more exciting opportunities for performers and audiences alike, as well as help to broaden our understanding and knowledge of this historical practice. So beginning with general concepts from treatises. The fantasia, or fantasy, as it's sometimes referred to, gained prominence during the early 17th and early 18th centuries as an instrumental style with maximum compositional freedom. Not tied to specific forms, composers or improvisers could be led by harmonic progressions and explorations. The musician was free to follow their fancy. Kircher terms the style stilus fantasticus. Coleman writes that while this can be executed on any instrument, there must be passages chiefly calculated for that instrument, as otherwise it would have no effect. This encapsulates the secondary purpose of a fantasia to display technical virtuosity. While frequently explored as a compositional form, Coleman notes that fantasias were often extemporized by the greatest players, and Rousseau stresses that a fantasia, quote, differs from an ordinary piece in that it is invented in its execution and that it has no longer existence as soon as it is finished, end quote. It is interesting throughout to see writers advocate a sense of freedom within the fantasia, yet also constantly stressing the importance of sticking to certain proper ways or rules and the importance of a plan. Earlier Renaissance viol consort fantasias were very contrapuntal and usually for up to 6 players, usually for viol consort. This differs from the solo Baroque fantasia that I am discussing here. So from this, we can tell that a Baroque fantasia was an instrumental piece, ideally improvised and with much more compositional freedom than the other forms at the time. However, it was still considered necessary to follow the harmonic language of the time and to take the stylistic elements and characteristics from other styles already in use. However, you can't just now pick up a violin and improvise a fantasia based on this knowledge that would be stylistic. So I've gone a step further by analysing the composed examples that we have available by Telemann and Matthäus. So beginning with Matthäus, this are the first few bars of one of his fantasias, and you can see here it's quite a distinctive style. It's almost like a prelude sorts of structural chords with ornaments in between. And this is sort of representative of quite a large body of his unaccompanied violin fantasias. And the results from the research of all of these are as follows. So if a violinist was wanting to improvise a fantasia in his style or taking inspiration from these, the violinist might like to put it in 4/4. He often chooses a minor key. They tend to be between 30 and 56 bars long. Use the full range of the violin. So at this time, this means using the bottom G string all the way up to an E string an octave above the top E string on a violin. Sometimes occasionally a little bit higher, but generally within that range. There are frequent double, triple, and quadruple stops. So this means playing 2, 3, or 4 strings at the same time. In other words, providing the harmony as well as the melody. He frequently uses pedals, and rhythmic devices include running semiquavers, running quavers, sometimes triplets, sometimes dotted rhythms, and also sometimes a quaver plus 2 quavers, or quaver plus 2 semiquavers, or 2 semiquavers plus a quaver, creating a sort of a gallop effect. There are also usually 2 sections, or the piece is through composed. Modulations are to the subdominant, dominant, relative major or minor, dominant of new key. There are some other modulations in passing, but these tend to be the major ones. And the whole pieces are structured largely around suspensions. As we saw from the example at the beginning, they tend to be structural chords with ornamentation in between, along with some scalic and arpeggiatic movement. The only real outlier in this style is his Alia Fantasia, which we can see here. This I've decided to consider separately because it is such a different kind of piece. So this, as you can see all the way through, has minims and semibreves. This, to a violinist of the time, meant constant rolling chords. For example, just the first couple of bars there to show you the technique. And while this was often used in other violin pieces from the time, and other of Matthäus's fantasias, they're never used quite to this extent. The whole feature of this piece seems to be this virtuosic technique. So as a separate kind of fantasia, these are the guidelines that you might use from my analysis, taking inspiration from it. So there's a constant minim rolling arpeggios. There's also some crotchet movement to provide melodic interest. Again, the full range of the violin. This is quite a little bit longer at 87 bars. Again, in 4/4, is through composed, has frequent modulations to similar keys as the other fantasias by Matthäus, is in A minor, and the piece is led again by resolutions. So, having got all this explicit knowledge of the concepts of the fantasia and also specifically some that were written for violin, we now have sort of a list, if you like, of guidelines that we can draw from. However, actually applying these in improvisation is quite a different story. As you can tell, a key feature of all of these is the use of double, triple, and quadruple stops. And this is quite challenging on the violin, particularly at speed. I found that when trying to include them in my improvisations, I couldn't do it quick enough. I couldn't think of what bass note to play, what chord to play, what notes were in that chord, and then how to space them on the violin. Because we're restricted by the tunings of the 4 strings and the number of fingers that we have, there's only certain possible ways of spacing each of the chords, and this can be quite limited depending on the key and how high up or down the violin you are. And so I found this to be quite difficult. While I could practice a considerable amount in one key, learning the different chords, and this could then be quite fluent, applying that to other keys, you basically have to start again, which is not very practical. So I've tried to come up with a system in order to help violinists, inspired by Dorian Bandy's recent study on the impact of violin technique on baroque contrapuntal composition. He says, quote, "Musical thought occurs as much on the fingerboard as on the manuscript leaf," end quote, and argues that just as Bach's works were are now commonly acknowledged to have been influenced by his physical playing style, that this must have also been the case for violinists and their compositions. And so I've taken inspiration from this and found a way that we can use hand shapes to create these harmonies. This is a process that means it can be quite intuitive, you can embed the knowledge, it can be in the muscle memory, which we rely on a lot in improvisation because of the lack of thinking time. So this is an example of some of the hand shapes that I've come up with. The theory behind this was that while I struggled to create chords themselves, I could usually, reliably, add an interval above or below, for example, a sixth, a third, or an octave. Intervals that we play a lot as violinists, we might have done as scales in the classical tradition. This I found relatively easy to add. And so my thinking was that if adding chords could be as easy as adding a hand shape above or below, like an interval, then this would be a much more fluent way of tackling improvisations. And it so happens that actually the same hand shape can be played anywhere on the violin in the positions shown on the screen, that will produce the same chord anywhere. So if we're thinking about a root position chord or a 5-3, if you're thinking figured bass, this hand shape of a fifth plus a major sixth that you can see on the screen can be replicated anywhere on the violin, and that will always create you a root position major chord. For example, I could play it in traditional first position, but I could also put it into third position, or in between. So this it means it's much easier to improvise chords at speed because the decision-making process is limited to choosing a bass note, choosing a kind of chord. Then the hand shapes, once they've been practiced a little bit, can be internalized, and this is the same for any key. This also happily works if you're trying to do a root position minor chord, which you can see from my tablature here. You need a fifth and a minor sixth. Same can be the case here. You can see with in case you couldn't see properly on the screen, I've got my fingers in the positions for the root position major and root position minor. So there's different ways of learning the hand shapes, either from the tablature or from photos like this. Essentially, it's about the feeling that it creates in the hand. This is also the case of first inversion major, first inversion minor chords, which look as follows. Again, just simply two intervals and you've got a chord. You can also put some different fingers as a bass note. For example, here you could have the photo is with the first finger as the bass note, but you could also have a second finger. However, the more challenging the chord, for example, for something like a seventh, or if you're going higher up the violin, it becomes quite challenging if on the fourth finger, if you have a third finger as a bass note. And so as a general rule, having a first or a second finger at the bottom is usually the best way of going about it. So again, similar principle applies to second inversion major and second inversion minor chords, this time involving three fingers. And a seventh chord can also be created like this. So this method of hand shapes applies to creating chords, but also actually to sequences. For example, if you have a sequence that fits neatly within a hand shape, the whole hand can simply be moved up, repeating the finger pattern, making it much easier in improvisation to improvise sequences. Or the finger pattern can be transferred across to a different string, moving the sequence up by a certain interval, again making this process much easier and much quicker. However, the main benefit of this for me has been in order to use this to improvise fantasias in the style of Matthäus. For example, by choosing a hand shape and then ornamenting in between, choosing another hand shape, you can create a fantasia much like the first ones that I discussed earlier on. So I thought I'd just show you briefly now what that might sound like, how it might look. to using the same principle to create a fantasia in the style of the Alia fantasia, the one with all the rolling chords. So for this, you can just pick a bass note, a hand shape, and you've got a chord. And by adding lots of these in sequence together, this allows the improvisation of this particular style of fantasia to be much more fluent. For example. So this is one style of fantasia. The second style that is particularly prevalent for the violin is that by Telemann. This is the opening of his Fantasia No. 1 for violin. He wrote fantasias, unaccompanied fantasias for the violin, the flute and the gamba, 12 for each. And I've analysed them for some features, and these are the most common. They use, again, the whole range of the violin. They have 3 contrasting sections, at least, sometimes more. These sections employ dance characteristics. We can often identify sarabands and jigs, amongst others. There's lots of passing modulations, some larger modulations to the relative major or minor. Lots of contrasting articulation and dynamics. Scales and arpeggios are frequently used for the melody, but also moments of chromaticism and larger leaps. Rhythmic devices are similar to those in Matthäus, running quavers, running semiquavers, dotted rhythms, triplets, but also some more lilting rhythms, for example, a crotchet plus a quaver, or quaver plus a crotchet, as well as Scottish snaps. There is often a sense of a bass line, whether this is created through the double or triple stops, or through fast passage work with large leaps between some of the notes at the bottom, some of the notes at the top. They are in a much broader range of keys, but these are generally limited to those that are slightly easier on the violin, so ones with sort of 4 or fewer sharps or flats. And they can last up to about 100 bars. So again, the harmony hand shape method can be used here in order to help harmonise melodies. It can be used either to harmonise down, so where you're thinking of a melody and you add some chords underneath it, or where you start from the chords and build a melody on top, like that. However, the best way that I found to practice improvising these is through games. So again, you can, for example, take a famous tune, harmonise it weirdly and wonderfully with the hand shapes, or you can do weird and wonderful chords and create tunes over the top of that, and then gradually progress to making them sort of more stylistic by using harmonies that are more prevalent during the baroque. But one of my favourite games actually allows you to improvise a whole fantasia, so I thought I would share that one with you today. This game I have called Lost in Hamburg. So the idea for this is that you are in Hamburg, on your way to see Telemann in the town hall, which we can see in the centre of the screen here, but you're lost. And so you ask directions from people, but in return for this, they want you to improvise small sections based on where you are. So as you can see, there's several different locations on this map, and you can pick as many or as few as you want, depending on how long you want your fantasia to last. For example, for time here, I might just pick 3. And the idea is that each place is paired with an affect from a treatise from the time, and the idea that you play in a major or a minor key, in line with the majority of treatises' opinions. Of course, we know they range quite widely, but this is a starting point, something inspirational for the improviser to use. For example, you might pick the prison, which is quick-tempered, tempests, furies, and should be in a minor key. Equally, you could go to the arsenal or the guest house. There's also Newmarket, a church, St. Catharinen, and the stock exchange. So within these is quite a range. You can pick at random, you can deliberately pick. And the idea that is, in each of these sections, you then can also pick a rhythm from the rhythms that I've identified as being common within Telemann's fantasias, and pair these to one to each section, or more if you like. This gives you also a secondary starting point of the rhythm. And what this means is that the improviser can even involve the audience. This is proved quite popular in live performance if you ask an audience member to pick the rhythm, for example, or to pick which places they want you to stop off at. And so they've had a sort of hand in the fantasia itself. You can also, for fun, ask people to compose you themes or compose your own theme in which to base them around, or purely improvise them as you go. The advantage of this game is that it breaks down what's quite a long improvisation with very specific styles and characters into something that's manageable, into some different sections with different advice or suggestions for each one. And this means that you can create a much more fluent improvisation, I found, in the end. So I thought I'd just end by demonstrating you one in the style of Telemann. And for the sake of time, I've just picked 3 rhythms at random. So we've got the Arsenal, which is militant in a major key with a dotted rhythm. Then the Newmarket, which is sad, melancholic in minor key with triplets. And then the Town Hall, which is rejoicing, in the key that I've started in, and using Scottish snaps. So hopefully this has shown that through using more specific guidance, both from an explicit point of view in terms of analysis and from a practical perspective, for example, looking at harmony hand shapes and the games, that more research into other instruments can help us to create more fantasias in different styles. This demystifies the process by splitting it and acknowledges the necessary stages of also implementing all of this research as well. And also looking at specific issues or difficulties, challenges on different instruments, which is not transferable across. Of course, the general treatise knowledge can be used for further research into other fantasias, and hopefully this will serve as a method or an approach that is useful for other instruments, not only for the baroque fantasia, but for other forms of improvisation. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to watching the other presentations. I keep up to date my Facebook, Twitter and YouTube accounts with my latest projects, the results of my research. If you can just find me by searching for Nina Kümin, Improvising Violinist. And I'm also in a duo called Weaver and Wood that you might be interested in. We fuse early music and folk music through improvisation. Thank you very much.